He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday and Friday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content such as interviews and D&D campaigns at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues, Campfire Clues. I am your host Taylor, and today we're going to be diving into the Harrison Encounters. So my wife and I recently took a trip out to the coast, and throughout our travels we stayed overnight in Harrison Hot Springs. Now, I will be doing a full-on follow-up episode on my experience with images and foot impressions, castings, and tons of other amazing pieces of evidence from the locals, all added into a blog posting on our website. But for today, we're going to dive into some unreported Bigfoot sightings that I acquired while visiting. Now, these stories accumulated over the span of 2018 to 2022, and it's basically just an archive of people that visited the town and just put their reports out to be recorded here. Now, this is all unreported, so it's not put out all into the internet or anything like that, which makes this even much more awesome just to have had this boots on the ground experience and really engage with people on this level. So that being said, when I mentioned 2018 to 2022, these sightings span throughout the decades. They are not limited only to the past 5 years. But before we get into all that, a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. You can also find us on Patreon, where you can get ad-free early episodes available there, including the Haunt of the Grassman campaign that I am working through with Ruben right now. Big shout outs to him for working on that series. Episode 2 has dropped officially on our Patreon with an episode 2 preview that launched on our main feeds, because it's just such a great story. We had to give you guys a little bit something extra to enjoy with the part 2, because it's getting good. Part 3 will be coming eventually here soon. Stay tuned to our social media feeds for updates on that. And lastly, if you want to say hi or reach out to us, you can send an email our way at cryptidclues@gmail.com. But without further ado, let's get into this. Upon visiting Harrison, we checked into the Sasquatch Museum, and the curator there was incredible. We talked about many reports and evidence, and that's what led me to these. So to start us off with our first encounter, and I quote, "A woman told a story of seeing a Sasquatch in 1990 at Meager Creek. She and her boyfriend drove to the hot springs in the middle of winter. The roads were not plowed for the last kilometer, so they hiked in the rest of the way through the snow. On their way back to their car, at the end of the day, she saw a Sasquatch with one arm leaning on a tree, just staring at them. She said it was like a freeze frame. She said to her boyfriend, 'What the is that?' And they both ran as fast as they could through the snow to get to the car, looking back frequently to make sure it wasn't chasing them." End quote. Now, I feel like some of these are going to kind of feel like just riddling off bullet points here, but we'll keep on trekking. So, our next encounter is as follows, and I quote, "A young man in his 20s came in with his aunt. His aunt told him it was safe to tell me his story and that I would not laugh at him. He explained that he lived in Hayward with his mother in the country by Stave Lake. In around 2013, he and his friend were sitting on the back porch drinking a pop in the summertime. They had a 6-foot wooden fence in the backyard, not too far from the porch. While sitting there, a giant Sasquatch head rose a good 2 feet above the fence. He said they were terrified and ran into the house yelling for his mother. When they looked out shortly after, it was gone, but large branches were broken from behind the fence where they had seen it. A person nearby overheard this account and started laughing. He said, 'That's why I don't tell anyone.'" End quote. I just want to say now that most of these encounters don't come from a place of individuals seeking fame or fortune. It's just good to talk about it, and it takes courage to share it. When this or anything incredible happens, you immediately want to share it and talk about it. But that instant realization that can swoop over you, knowing no one will ever believe you, it's not a good feeling. It can depressing. So many more reports and encounters exist out there, but they will fade away into history because people ultimately would have laughed instead of listened. But let us continue listening with our next encounter, and I quote, "A native hunter from Merritt, BC, said he had seen one many years ago while he was hunting. He said he's found footprints on several occasions. He showed me a video of large footprints in the snow, very far apart, going up the mountain. There were no other footprints around them, just clean, smooth snow. He said seeing one is terrifying." End quote. And I quote, "Two young men came in with their parents. They had just come over the border, and they told the border guard they were heading for Sasquatch Provincial Park. The border guard told them a story of finding huge footprints that he believed to be Bigfoot. When he reported it to the authorities, an unmarked helicopter showed up shortly after. Someone got out, took a picture, and wiped away the prints and flew away." End quote. Now, this is a great repeated instance of an unmarked and unknown agency, yet again, getting directly involved with possibly very credible evidence of a Sasquatch. Now, note, not just from a random tourist or an individual unknown out hiking, but coming in from a prominent government agency, to me it seems logical to follow up with a report like that. That's why you can't always trust all the agencies out there. Me and Ruben have looked into previous episodes with Men in Black and just these kind of agencies associated with the more unknown side of these cryptids, and it's just such a rabbit hole. It really, really is. But moving on, our next encounter, and I quote, "An elderly man said when he was a child, he lived with his parents by the mouth of Harrison River. One day he was walking with his mother along the river's edge and came across giant footprints. When he asked his mother what it was, she answered in a very matter-of-fact way that it must be Sasquatch prints." End quote. Now, personally, I love that directness, and if I was in that same situation with my own children, I would absolutely deduce the same conclusion over dismissing it as being nonsense. If you see a print and, by God, that's a Bigfoot print, say it as it is. Speak it. Don't try and dismiss it as being a bear. Now, again, I'm not saying just assume and just kind of be optimistic, like, oh, it must be, like going with a little bit of certainty, but don't dismiss the imagination that is coming out of this question and the inquisitive curiosity, because it very well could be the true. Now, with this experience, I managed to speak to a friend of the family that went through this precarious situation, and I quote, 1987. Bill Malone was hiking deep in the woods with a friend partway up Yak Mountain close to the Coquihalla toll booth. They came across a horrible stench and began looking for what they thought was a dead animal. They continued exploring and eventually found what appeared to be a den, where the ground was flattened out. And they also found giant footprints not far from there. End quote. Now, this was where they actually chose to get the heck out of there and not stick around. And getting to speak to someone who is closely associated with this experience was very, very fascinating. And I've been to Yak Mountain. I haven't hiked up to the top. My wife has, and it's a very precarious hike, very, very treacherous, but nonetheless, you can do it. And the Coquihalla is just if you don't know what that is, it is a long piece of highway, a summit that kind of connects between like Kelowna, the Okanagan, to the lower mainland, Chilliwack, Vancouver, that sort of stuff. But it's a main highway, and all around is tons and tons of forest. If something wants to hide, it can hide. But again, speaking to the friend of the family on this instance, like I said, it was amazing. There's a lot of sincerity from the discussion. And also, just the mention of the den is crazy. I don't think I'll ever be decisive on what or how these things live, but it blows my mind whenever mentions arise of what could actually be a residence, so to speak, habitat, habitual area, a home base for a Bigfoot. It's crazy to think about, and that's something that I can't wait to get more into with Ruben. Now, we have another encounter here told by a man that this occurred 19 years ago. Before we get to that, quick ad break and we'll be right back. And we're back. And I quote, "He and his wife and 10-year-old son were biking on a trail by Deer Lake. His wife had fallen behind, and when he looked back to see her, he saw a silver-tipped, very large and tall creature, presuming to be a Sasquatch, turning around to return where it came from. His wife saw it charging through the bush towards her just prior to that." End quote. Now this one is interesting, and not to kind of go devil's advocate here, too hard at least, but if it was present day, I would have had a hard time kind of standing with this, as present day Deer Lake is nestled pretty much in the middle of Burnaby, British Columbia. Now, whilst that area is still wooded, it's surrounded by highways and cities. Going back nearly 20 years ago, oh gosh, absolutely, this area could have been inhabited by a Sasquatch, or perhaps even one just passing through. Now, it's worth noting if there are underground access points that have not been discovered by people, maybe this is just one of those areas that has an opening and these things pop out every now and again, just see what's kicking and go back down and continue along their underground highway somewhere else. I can't say that's just one possible explanation, but I digress. On the topic of Deer Lake, however, and I quote, "A couple that were camping at Deer Lake came in to see the museum. They asked what animals lived in the forest, as they could not identify a howling they heard during the night. I played the audio tape of a recording of a Sasquatch that campers taped in 1971. They looked stunned, looked at each other and said that was exactly what they heard." End quote. Now, if you want to get more information on that, me and Ruben have done a whole episode on Sasquatch communication. We've also looked into the Sierra Sounds. We've interviewed Ron Moorhead. It was a fantastic experience to be able to talk with him. That's available on our main feeds as well. Moving on to our next encounter, however, and I quote, "A man from Skye came across giant footprints a few years ago, and on one other occasion, heard an unrecognizable howling in the woods." End quote. And finally, and I quote, "August 1990, a woman driving by Patterson Lake in Winthrop, Washington, witnessed a Sasquatch cross the road not far in front of her, stepping over a high cement barrier in stride on the other side of the road." End quote. Again, I think these creatures are passing through the borders with relative ease. Even easier should the concept of underground highways, like I mentioned before, be proven right. Before exploring Harrison, though, me and my wife did some cave exploring with a local guide, and I managed to gather some insights on the caves themselves that I will be sharing with you in the Harrison episode I will be releasing soon. But I digress. I'm kind of nearing a good center middle part of the episode here, and I'm just gonna keep on throwing more of these encounters your way, so buckle up. And I quote, "A BC family, mother, adult son, and 2 grandchildren, talked of some footprints found on the west side of Harrison Lake on their way to Agnes Wells in the early 1990s. They were driving along the forestry road when the son, a child at the time, asked to stop the car to take a quick pee on the side of the road. A few steps into the bush, he found giant footprints. His father looked further and found another one several feet away. He managed to get a cast of it, and it ended up in storage packed away somewhere. It apparently had hair stuck to it as well. She said she would look for it and also call Thomas Steenberg." End quote. Now, if you aren't aware, Thomas Steenberg is a prominent Bigfoot investigator who has written several books on them, including additional sightings. Moving on, however, and I quote, "A man had large boulders being tossed close to him into a river he was fishing in close to Canmore. He also heard knocking in the woods. He responded to the knocks and had a response each time." End quote. Now, Canmore is a town in Alberta's Rocky Mountains. It's west of Calgary, and coincidentally, nearby is the Canmore Nordic Centre Provincial Park. I will withhold my crazy rants on national parks for this episode, but I don't think I need to really get into one considering that we have a national park right near this sighting. I do find it very intriguing, however, he was able to receive a response when he attempted to do a tree knock. I don't prescribe to the concept of wood knocking in the woods because, I don't prescribe especially to anyone else doing it. I don't advocate for that because you don't know what you're saying. And you could piss off an animal that's already having a relatively bad day and you just don't want to do that. Moving on to our next encounter, and I quote, "A man came in and told a story of a friend of his camping in the bush in BC. He was in his tent when an animal started rubbing up the side of it. He had a pistol and thinking it was a bear, looked outside of the tent to scare it off. When he shone the flashlight on the animal, it had a human-like face covered in hair. He went back in his tent and emptied a round of bullets from his gun through the tent wall. He stayed up all night, and the next morning he found no evidence of any injured animal outside." End quote. And I quote, "Vicky C. from New Brunswick was camping at Trout Lake at the ECETI Ranch in Washington State in June of 2018. While standing outside her tent, a big black figure approximately 12 feet tall, she later scaled it from where the head was on the branch of a tree in the background, walked past around 200 feet away. She said she felt paralyzed and couldn't move. It turned and looked at her, kept walking, and then dematerialized into nothing, faded into nothing before her eyes. Right after that, there were 2 flashes of light. According to the ranch staff, there are regular sightings in that area." End quote. Now, this is definitely something that gets more into the spiritual side and maybe even a little bit more to the quantum side as well that Ron Moorhead talks about, where when you look into some encounters, they are very physical, they're 3-dimensional, and they're subject to our laws in our realm, our world. But the other dimensions that exist out there, and again, this is getting very heavy down the rabbit hole, there are some encounters where people see these things and they compare it to the Predator. And if you've seen that Arnold Schwarzenegger Predator film where this thing is swinging in the trees, jumping around, and it just goes into a cloak mode where you can't see it anymore. That's what people equate it to. They see this Bigfoot dematerialize. And then that's something that Ron Moorhead prescribes to, where basically they can enter into the quantum realm. They have this ability that allows them to, and again, this is something as well that I believe that as human beings we can inherently learn this ability too. It's just something we are so far disconnected with, so it would take a very long time to teach ourselves to, or I guess reteach ourselves to be able to do this. But I always get fascinated when people are able to actually see, and the balls of light always seem to have some association with cryptids, and it's evident here. If this Bigfoot did indeed go into another realm, balls of light kind of floating around in the aftermath. Just fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. But I digress, and I quote, "A local resident from Harrison reported seeing a family of Sasquatch on a regular basis. He did not want the location identified." End quote. I couldn't agree more. That is something that needs to stay private, and even if I did happen to have that location, I would not have revealed such a specific thing, especially in regards to a family of them. But, and I quote, "A fisherman came in and told of a Sasquatch sighting story when he was a child, fishing with his father at the south end of Haida Gwaii. While fishing off the coast, they spotted 2 Sasquatch seemingly playing on the shoreline. As an adult, he started a fishing company and went back to Haida Gwaii to fish. After a couple of days, another one appeared on the shore, but stayed briefly." End quote. And with what will probably be our last encounter of today's episode, and I quote, "A man from Washington came in and told a story of an experience somewhere about 60 miles north of Vancouver in 1976 by a very small lake in the country. It was dark, and he and a friend were walking along a fire road when they heard rustling in the trees from above. Then, a large rock hit the ground close to them. They shone a flashlight in the trees, but the brush was too thick to see anything. They turned the flashlight off and the rustling happened again. So they shone it again, but could see nothing, and then another large rock fell to the ground. They decided to get out of there. End quote. Now, you know what? We're going to do a couple more here. These are just so awesome just to be exploring right now with you guys. And I quote, "A woman came in with a story about her grandparents driving southwest of Rocky Mountain House, Alberta on October 20th, 2020. A silver gray brown 9 to 10 foot Sasquatch ran across the road in front of them. The woman's brother sent back to the site and found large prints." End quote. Now, this other one here, this is something I really started exploring, was Ruby Creek. There's a fascinating amount of information that's just coming out of this little area here about Bigfoot. And I quote, "So a couple came in after just visiting the Chapman property at Ruby Creek and found fresh prints going up a hill September 1st, 2022. End quote. That one is insanely close. Very, very recent. And I love that very much. Our last one for tonight, though, and I quote, "A couple came in with a story of camping at Yellowstone National Park in 2019. While staying there, they found tree structures and woven branches. Behind the campground pine cones and small rocks got thrown at them." End quote. Very good example of just maybe not going where you're supposed to and just being warned out, because in instances like this, they've been known to escort or get really territorial. Again, I'm not a professional and I can't dissect and decipher exactly what these mannerisms mean, but to me as a person, it doesn't sound like it's friendly and receptive, especially when rocks are being thrown at you. But I digress. That does it for this week's episode of Campfire Clues. I hope you enjoyed it. I have plenty more encounters I'll be diving to in future episodes. And again, be sure to stay tuned for the Harrison Sasquatch Museum episode I'll be releasing, where I also go as well into a little bit of the cave networks found in North America. But with that, be sure to check out our website at CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, as well as our Patreon, where you can get the ad-free early episodes. Additionally, if you want to say hi or reach out, you can send an email our way at cryptidclues@gmail.com. And until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe.